The massive steel gates of the Blackstone estate slammed shut, cutting off the dusty dirt road that had belonged to the Miller family for 4 generations. Standing on the other side was Arthur Vance, a billionaire developer whose face had graced the covers of every major financial magazine, holding a pristine piece of white paper. At his feet stood Thomas Miller, a weathered farmer with dirt under his fingernails and mud on his boots. Arthur smiled, a cold, calculated expression, and whispered a brutal truth: "Your dirt is worth millions, Thomas. But your name isn't on the deed anymore. Get off my property." But Arthur didn't know about the iron box buried under the old barn. Welcome back, everyone. If you're new here, grab a seat because tonight's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this little community reaches. Tonight's story is about pride, cruelty. To understand how a man with an endless bank account could simply wipe a family off the map, you have to understand the sheer, terrifying power of paper versus reality. For decades, the valley had lived by a simple rule: if you clear the land, if you sweat over the soil, if you harvest the crops, the land belongs to you. The community ran on handshakes and mutual trust. Thomas Miller was the living embodiment of that philosophy. His hands were calloused, his back was permanently bent from decades of labor, and his word was as good as gold. He didn't care about the stock market, he didn't care about shifting economic tides, and he certainly didn't care about the soaring price of real estate creeping in from the metropolitan cities just 2 hours away. But the world outside the valley was changing rapidly. The global economy was undergoing a massive shift, and wealthy elites like Arthur Vance were hunting for tangible assets. Arthur didn't see a beautiful valley, a thriving ecosystem, or a historic family legacy. When Arthur looked at the Miller family farm, he saw columns on a spreadsheet. He saw a massive, untapped resource that could be leveraged, securitized, and turned into a massive playground for the ultra-wealthy. Arthur understood a dark truth about the modern world: in the legal system, actual physical possession means absolutely nothing if you don't control the piece of paper that dictates ownership. Arthur had spent months quietly buying up the surrounding plots of land, turning the local smallholders into tenants or pushing them out entirely through aggressive legal maneuvering. He used shell companies, complex corporate structures, and legions of high-priced attorneys to build a legal wall around the valley. Every piece of property was falling into his hands like dominoes, except for one stubborn, massive central piece: the Miller farm. Thomas had flatly refused every single multi-million-dollar offer Arthur sent his way. To Thomas, selling the land wasn't just a transaction, it was a betrayal of his ancestors who had survived droughts, depressions, and wars on that very soil. Seeing that money couldn't buy Thomas's pride, Arthur decided to play dirty. He employed a strategy common in the corporate world but utterly devastating to a simple farmer. He launched a forensic audit of the county's historical land registry records. His lawyers spent weeks digging through dusty archives, looking for a single vulnerability, a tiny bureaucratic mistake made 50 or 100 years ago. And they found it. A minor discrepancy in a 1940 court clerk's filing meant that the official modern title deed to the Miller farm was technically flawed. On paper, according to the modern government database, the land's boundaries were invalid. Armed with this weapon, Arthur didn't even bother offering a final settlement. He simply filed an emergency injunction. Within 48 hours, local law enforcement officers, who had known Thomas his entire life, were forced to show up at the farm with eviction notices. They were visibly shaken, refusing to look Thomas in the eye as they handed over the paperwork. Arthur Vance arrived shortly after in a sleek black SUV, flanked by private security guards, ready to take physical control of the territory. Thomas stood on the porch of the house his grandfather had built, watching heavy bulldozers and excavation equipment idle at the edge of his property line, ready to tear down the historic barns and ancient oak trees the moment he stepped off the perimeter. Arthur walked up the steps, holding the freshly stamped court order. The contrast was stark: a man whose entire wealth was built on digital numbers, paper contracts, and legal technicalities, standing across from a man whose entire existence was rooted in the physical reality of the earth. Arthur told Thomas that his legacy was over, that the law had spoken, and that no amount of crying or complaining would alter the digital record. The system had declared Arthur the winner. Thomas didn't yell. He didn't scream. He looked at the bulldozers, then looked directly into Arthur's eyes. He took a deep breath, stepped off the porch, and walked toward the old barn one last time to collect his personal belongings. But as he reached into the darkest, deepest corner of the tool shed, his foot struck a loose floorboard that had been covered by heavy iron machinery for nearly a century. Beneath it lay a rusted, heavy iron lockbox, sealed with thick wax that had turned black with age. Arthur Vance stood outside the perimeter fence, watching the first excavator roar to life. Its massive steel bucket tore into the century-old wooden fence rails, splintering the aged oak into thousands of worthless pieces. To the casual observer, this was a done deal. The billionaire had won, the system had worked exactly as it was designed to. And the penniless farmer was officially a trespasser on his own ancestral soil. Arthur checked his gold watch, completely unbothered by the destruction. In his mind, physical structures were completely temporary, only the digital ledger of ownership mattered. But inside the dark, dusty barn, Thomas Miller was looking at something that defied the modern system entirely. His hands trembled as he brushed the thick layer of soot and decayed straw off the heavy iron lockbox. The wax seal across the latch was cracked, but intact. It bore an emblem that hadn't been used by any local government agency in nearly 200 years, a stamped impression of a crown and a coiled serpent. If Arthur Vance had known what Thomas was holding at that exact second, he wouldn't have been smiling at his bulldozers. He would have been calling his high-priced legal team in a state of absolute panic. But why would a billionaire fear a rusty box? Because the modern financial and legal system operates on an illusion, the belief that the newest piece of paper, the latest digital update, always overrides the past. Arthur's entire eviction strategy was built on a minor clerical error from 1940. He assumed the history of the land started and stopped with the modern county registry. He had no idea that the soil beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes held a deep, legal secret that predated the very existence of the county itself. Thomas carefully lifted the heavy box, placing it into the back of his battered old pickup truck, driving past the security guards without saying a single word. He wasn't retreating, he was mobilizing. The next morning, news of the eviction spread through the valley like wildfire. The locals were outraged, but they felt completely powerless. How do you fight a man who can buy the law? Arthur had already hired a massive crew to begin surveying the land for a massive, gated luxury resort. Flags of bright neon pink and blue were driven into the fertile soil where corn had grown just weeks prior. Arthur had even instructed his team to clear-cut the old forest at the edge of the property line to make room for a private golf course. He was in a massive rush to alter the physical layout of the land, knowing that once the old structures were leveled and new foundations were poured, it would become nearly impossible for any court to reverse the damage. He was creating a reality on the ground that matched his stolen paper title. Meanwhile, Thomas sat in a small, dimly lit room at the local library, sitting across from Evelyn Carter, a retired historical archivist who specialized in colonial-era land grants. The iron box sat between them on the wooden table. With great care, using a heated blade, Evelyn slowly melted the ancient black wax seal and pried open the rusted latch. The hinges shrieked in protest, releasing a smell of old parchment, dried cedar, and oxidized metal. Inside lay a single, thick scroll of vellum, wrapped in cracked leather and tied with a faded silk ribbon. This wasn't a standard land deed from the local courthouse. This was something completely different. As Evelyn untied the ribbon and carefully unrolled the thick, animal skin parchment, her eyes went wide, and the color drained completely from her face. She looked up at Thomas, her voice shaking. "Thomas, do you have any idea what this is?" she whispered, looking around the empty library to ensure no one was listening. "Arthur Vance thinks he bought this land from the state registry. But this document, this is an original sovereign land patent, signed directly by the founding governor before the state even existed. And it contains a clause that changes everything. To the average person, an old piece of paper might seem completely irrelevant compared to a modern, stamped court order from a high court judge. But in the world of property law, a sovereign land patent is the absolute apex predator. It is the original root of all subsequent titles. If the original patent contains specific, permanent conditions, no future registry, no modern law, and no billionaire's money can ever alter them. It is the ultimate legal shield, a financial contract written in stone that cannot be broken by digital manipulation. Evelyn pointed her shaking finger to the bottom of the vellum, where a large, dark wax seal was embedded into the skin itself. Next to it was an intricate, hand-drawn map of the valley, detailed with precise geographical landmarks that Arthur Vance's bulldozers were currently preparing to destroy. The text was written in archaic, formal legal language, but its meaning was devastatingly clear. The patent granted the land to the Miller family line in perpetuity, with an explicit covenant. The land could never be seized, taxed, or transferred by any secondary corporate or government entity, provided that a direct descendant of the original grantee physically occupied and maintained the soil. If any entity attempted a forced seizure, all legal authority over the surrounding territory would instantly collapse. Thomas looked out the window, a quiet determination washing over his face. The billionaire thought he had played the ultimate chess move. In reality, he had walked directly into a trap laid by men who died 2 centuries ago. Back at the Miller farm, the destruction was accelerating. Arthur Vance had brought in heavy industrial wood chippers, turning trees that had stood for generations into piles of landscaping mulch. He stood under a temporary white canvas tent, drinking expensive coffee and reviewing the architectural blueprints for his luxury resort. To Arthur, the physical land was just raw material waiting to be molded by his capital. He felt completely secure. His legal team had double-checked the modern county registry 3 times, the loophole they used was ironclad by modern corporate standards. The eviction was fully legal under State Statute 404. But Arthur was operating under a massive delusion. He believed that the state government was the highest power in the land, completely unaware that the vellum scroll sitting in the local library held a legal authority that dictated terms to the state itself. Suddenly, Arthur's phone rang. It was his lead corporate attorney, corporate counsel powerhouse Marcus Croft, calling from a skyscraper downtown. Marcus's voice wasn't filled with its usual arrogance. It sounded tense, tight, and erratic. "Arthur, we have a massive problem," the lawyer said, his breath catching. An emergency motion was just filed in federal district court. Not the local county court, federal. Someone bypassed our entire injunction. They didn't even contest our modern deed audit. Arthur scoffed, watching a bulldozer push down the old stone well. So what? They missed the filing deadline for an appeal. The property is mine. There was a long, terrifying pause on the line. "Arthur, they aren't appealing the 1940 record. They produced a sovereign patent from 1792. If that document is authenticated, it doesn't just stop the resort. It invalidates our purchase of the entire surrounding valley. You could lose everything you invested." The word "lose" was not in Arthur Vance's vocabulary. He hung up the phone, his face turning a dark, furious crimson. He walked out from under the tent and ordered the heavy machinery operators to stop their engines. The sudden silence over the valley was deafening. Arthur knew that in the high-stakes world of asset acquisition, possession is 9/10 of the law only if you can destroy the evidence of the alternative reality before the courts intervene. If the ancient document relied on specific physical landmarks, like the historic stone well, the century-old boundary oaks, and the original foundations of the homestead, then erasing those landmarks from the face of the earth would make the document impossible to verify on the ground. He turned to his site foreman, his eyes cold and ruthless. "Tear it all down. Every building, every stone, every tree. Wipe this site completely flat by midnight. I don't care about the noise complaints. Do it now." But as the foreman reached for his radio to restart the bulldozers, a long line of pickup trucks and farm vehicles appeared at the edge of the property line. The local community, rallied by Thomas and Evelyn's discovery, had arrived. They didn't bring weapons, they brought their bodies. Dozens of local farmers, mechanics, and shopkeepers stepped out of their vehicles, forming a silent, unbroken human wall directly in front of the heavy machinery. At the front of the line stood Thomas Miller, holding a high-resolution, certified photocopy of the 1792 patent in his left hand, and his family's original iron lockbox in his right. Arthur walked toward the perimeter fence, his private security guards moving into defensive positions. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. It was a classic standoff, the unstoppable force of modern corporate capital meeting the immovable object of historical sovereign right. Arthur looked at the crowd with pure contempt, completely confident that his wealth would ultimately shield him from the consequences of his actions. He had no idea the trap was already springing. Arthur Vance smiled coldly, raising his megaphone to address the crowd blocking his bulldozers. You think an old piece of paper changes the reality of modern commerce? My lawyers own the courts in this state. You are trespassing on corporate property, and if you don't step aside, you will all be ruined financially and legally by sunset. But before the site foreman could give the order to advance, a black sedan with federal government plates pulled up to the security gate. A man in a dark suit stepped out, holding a bright red folder. It was a United States federal marshal, accompanied by a senior surveyor from the Bureau of Land Management. The marshal walked directly past Arthur's security team, ignoring their raised hands, and approached the canvas tent. He handed a document to Arthur. It was a federal emergency injunction, backed by an immediate cease and desist order. The engines of the bulldozer sputtered and died once more, this time by command of the federal government. Arthur's face turned white as he read the first page. The mid-story twist wasn't just that the 1792 sovereign land patent was legally valid, the twist was that the document didn't just cover Thomas Miller's farm. The original patent defined the entire valley as a single, indivisible sovereign agricultural tract. When the state government had redrawn the county lines in 1940 and broken the land into individual parcels for sale, they had committed a massive, foundational constitutional error. Because the original sovereign patent was never formally dissolved by the federal government or the Miller family line, every single piece of land Arthur Vance had purchased over the last 3 years, every commercial lot, every rented farm, every acre intended for his luxury resort, was legally invalid. He hadn't just failed to steal Thomas's farm, he had accidentally exposed the fact that he didn't legally own a single square inch of the entire valley. The shell companies he had used to buy up the surrounding properties had purchased fraudulent titles from a flawed state registry. The law of the land dictated that if the original patent boundaries were violated by a predatory entity, the ownership of the entire tract automatically reverted to the stewardship of the original patent holder's designated community trust. Arthur wasn't just stopped, he was completely stripped of his entire local real estate portfolio in a single legal stroke. Arthur stood paralyzed under the blazing sun, the paper trembling in his hand. He grabbed his phone, frantically dialing his chief financial officer. Liquidate the assets. Put the valley properties up as collateral for an emergency loan, do it right now, he screamed, his voice cracking with absolute panic. But the final reveal was about to deliver the absolute terminal blow to his entire global financial empire. Arthur Vance's multi-billion-dollar corporate infrastructure was built entirely on extreme leverage. He didn't use his own cash to buy land, he used the projected value of the future luxury resort as primary collateral to secure massive, high-interest lines of credit from major Wall Street investment banks. He had borrowed over $400 million against the clean titles of the valley land. Now, with a federal court declaring those titles completely fraudulent and void, the structural collateral backing his massive corporate loans had instantly vanished into thin air. At that exact moment, across the country on the fast-paced trading floors of the stock exchange, the news of the federal injunction hit the global wire. The investment banks realized they were holding hundreds of millions of dollars in toxic, completely unbacked corporate debt. The automated algorithm-driven trading systems reacted instantly to the systemic threat. A massive, catastrophic margin call was automatically triggered against Arthur Vance's core parent company. His stock price began to plummet in a sharp vertical line, losing 30% of its total market value in less than 7 minutes. The immense paper wealth that Arthur had spent a lifetime accumulating, the digital numbers on computer spreadsheets that he used to terrorize ordinary people, were evaporating in real time. He wasn't just losing a local land dispute. His entire global corporate infrastructure was completely imploding because he had anchored his financial leverage to a legal lie. He had tried to use a paper loophole to steal physical reality, but the physical reality of the ancient document had entirely destroyed his paper empire. Thomas Miller walked forward, stepping over the broken wooden fence rails that Arthur's massive machines had destroyed earlier. He stopped just a few feet away from the trembling, silent billionaire. The contrast between the two men was now complete. Arthur was surrounded by high-priced security, high-tech machinery, and endless digital notifications of his impending total financial bankruptcy. Thomas stood entirely alone, wearing his faded work clothes, holding the heavy iron lockbox that had preserved the absolute truth for over 2 centuries. The immense crowd of local citizens cheered loudly behind Thomas, their unified voices echoing off the green mountain ridges. The ancient document had done exactly what the founding ancestors intended. It acted as a permanent economic circuit breaker against predatory corporate tyranny. Arthur looked up from his phone, his eyes completely vacant, finally realizing that the simple farmer he had tried to crush now held absolute, total sovereign control over his entire destiny. The digital illusion of paper wealth had shattered completely against the unyielding physical rock of historical, unassailable, generational, foundational legal truth. The roar of the high-tech diesel engines was gone, replaced by the gentle, familiar sound of the afternoon wind rustling through the remaining cornfields. Arthur Vance didn't leave the valley in a sleek black SUV surrounded by security guards. His corporate vehicles were seized by federal creditors before the sun went down, leaving the broken former billionaire to walk down the dusty gravel road alone, carrying nothing but a cardboard box of personal files. The modern world of spreadsheets, leverage, and digital algorithms had completely abandoned him the moment his paper illusion collapsed. As he walked past the town perimeter, not a single person looked his way. He had spent his entire life believing that people were disposable and that land was just a commodity to be traded. In the end, he became the ultimate ghost in his own financial system, a man with no roots, no legacy, and no home. The next morning, the valley woke up to a completely different reality. The heavy industrial equipment was towed away, leaving behind deep, ugly mud tracks across the earth. But the community didn't wait for a government recovery grant to heal the wounds inflicted on the landscape. By sunrise, dozens of local families arrived at the Miller farm, bringing their own tractors, shovels, and saplings. They worked side by side, singing old songs, rebuilding the wooden fences, repairing the stone well, and planting new oak trees where the old ones had been brutally torn down. The corporate flags were gathered up and burned in a massive bonfire at the center of the property, their toxic neon colors turning into harmless gray ash that scattered across the wind. The physical land was being restored by the very hands that loved it, proving that true wealth is never found in a bank vault, but in the collective soul of a community that refuses to be bought. Thomas Miller stood on the porch of his family home, watching the children run through the restored fields. The old iron lockbox sat on the wooden table next to him, its heavy lid open, the ancient vellum scroll finally resting in peace. For the first time in 3 years, the heavy weight of anxiety left his shoulders, and he let out a long, emotional sigh. His grandfather's legacy had been saved, not by matching the billionaire's greed, but by relying on the unyielding, foundational truth that his ancestors had left buried in the dark. He looked down at his calloused, dirt-stained hands, knowing that these hands had held the line against an empire of paper lies. The soil beneath his boots felt warmer now, anchored by a legal shield that would protect his children, his grandchildren, and the entire valley for centuries to come. The digital world would continue to spin, markets would crash, and new financial empires would rise and fall, but the valley would remain untouched, growing food, nurturing lives, and standing as a permanent monument to the enduring power of physical reality. As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, casting a warm, golden glow across the rolling green hills, Thomas walked down the porch steps to join his neighbors at the celebration feast. He stopped at the edge of the property line, looking out at the vast, unbroken landscape that was now legally and permanently safe from corporate predation. He took a handful of the rich, dark soil, letting it slide slowly through his fingers back onto the ground. The contrast was finally settled. The billionaire had tried to own the earth with a pen, but the farmer had saved the earth with his soul. The paper empire was gone, but the eternal soil remained, vibrant, free, and unshakable.